Thank you so much for coming. I was going to, I was hoping there would be more sort of older Bengali people in the audience because I was going to play some interviews, some snippets from the interviews, and I was hoping that they would go into more detail about explaining what the poets are saying. It sounds more authentic that way, but they're not here, so that's fine. I'll change it around a little bit. Now, this project is, as I'm not sure how much everyone is aware of, but the idea behind this project, which was funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, but organized by Shanghai Literary Society. It's a society that's have existed since the early 80s. And the main reasoning behind this particular project was to archive, as Ahmedullah Bhai said, that we don't actually have much record of the stories of the Bengali community. Within the Bengali community, there is a lot of conversation, there is a lot of awareness of a lot of projects, functions, cultural related activities that are taking place, but in terms of recording them, we don't have much. I come from an archives background. I used to work at the largest archive in the country, in the National Archives, and for that I spent a year at the London Metropolitan Archives, which manages the archives related to the history of London as a whole. When it came to the Bengali community, the stories, the newspaper articles, whatever was there. So when I went in on the catalogue and I typed in Bangladesh or Bengalis, it was generally newspaper cutouts or some article and about Bangladeshis as a general, as a whole, in Britain or in London. And it was always, more or less, it was negative. It didn't say anything about the culture. It didn't say anything about the history. It was, oh, the Bengalis are raising money for a flood in Bangladesh, or there's a protest about some political event in Bangladesh. And of course, during the 70s, there was the other element of campaigning for the independence of Bangladesh, but it was always written by a white man, sometimes a white woman, but it was Bengalis as a subject. You know, they were the talked about topic, but rather the voice wasn't coming from them. And I think taken from that, this project, well, there are many projects that were set up, and I think Ahmedullah Bhai and the organizers of Shanghai, they came together to develop a project to have something archived regarding the Bengali community that was positive, that actually shares a rich history of the Bengali community. So when I came across this project, what fascinated me was it focused on a very prominent period for the Bangladeshis, but also there is an element of looking into the poetry scene of other communities and see how they intersect. And so one of the organizations that I was recommended to look into was the Basement Writers. So in addition to finding Bengali poets, I was also going out there searching for young people who were young in the 70s and that wrote poetry for Basement Writers. I'll go into detail about that in a bit. So that's how I started it. Now, when I started, one of the contention that existed was, who do I interview? Because there are organizations where people are quite well connected, they're well published, but then there are a lot of people who wrote poetry, they didn't necessarily see themselves as poets. And I hope today, at the end, you'll recognize how much poetry plays in the heart of Bengalis. So who do you kind of interview? And there was a lot of support for the idea that there are a lot of hidden poets out there and find their stories, because this project is about the history for the next generation of Bangladeshi. So my generation, I grew up knowing very little in this country. My parents obviously taught me a lot, but in terms of seeing my history, it wasn't out there. So that's what I took. I thought, I want to create something that is going to be beneficial, because it's going to be the voices of our parents' generation, but also it's going to tell the story of their experience here. It's going to tell the story of what they contributed here. Most Bangladeshis come from a working class background. When I came into this project, most of the people that I was recommended were middle class, well published. They already have a voice out there. They already have a platform out there. All the friends are recommending each other, but they have a platform. That wasn't my story. I didn't see that. I come from a working class family. My dad worked at night. I used to see him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because he was working till 2, and then I used to go to school, and so when I came home, there he was. But then he left for work again. There was no story of such men. And of course, women like my mother. So I wanted to go out there and find them. But obviously, such people are invisible. When it comes to the cultural scene, they are completely invisible. So the first thing that I did was, as well as connecting with people, poets who are already established, who run newspapers, and I have to say they were amazing because they shared my views. They said to me that, look, I've got this. I'm already part of this. I've already translated all these books. But where are the stories of, the guys that I used to work with in the factories? Because a lot of the educated people that came from Bangladesh, they started working in factories as well. But they were already, they already had a path to progress, going into something more academic, more professional. But they also kind of guided me towards people that they know, they've met in the past, or people who have actually done some independent publishing. But it's not quite known. Like my generation would not know anything about those people because they're not translated into English. We don't hang out in the same spaces. They don't come to this kind of events, but they have their own projects or their own sort of committee meetings somewhere out there. So that's how I began the journey. I started talking to people, and I also went to Bancroft Archives to see what kind of publications they might have. And of course, there was a very prominent newspaper which exists to this day, and it's one of the first newspapers to come into existence within the Bengali community, which is the Janamot newspaper. So when I started looking, as expected, the first people you come across are people who are already well published. But then there was some interesting poetry that I came across by women who are not exactly anywhere. Like I did not see their names on any list whatsoever. And so just to give you an idea of the magazines that I came across in Bancroft Archives, one is Bengali Mohila Shamiti, which is a women's magazine, Multicultural Bengali Association, which is for the Bengali community, but they're more involved in social activism and housing and things like that, and Nari Shangram. So Nari Shangram and Bengali Mohila Shamiti were both to do with women. Now, if anyone is wondering how much importance poetry plays in the Bengali community, all you have to do is just look at our publications, especially look at the publication that existed in the 60s, the 70s, and 80s. Doesn't matter if it was a political magazine, or if it was something to do with education, or if it was something to do with cooking. There was always a section, that was about poetry and also literature, like writing. People used to write and submit their stories. And in those magazines, I came across some female names, and I thought, there's no Facebook, no LinkedIn, how do I find them? And I started asking people. I did develop a relationship with several academics at SOAS who carried out their research focusing on the Bengali community. And strangely enough, somewhere along the line, I actually found some of these women. Unfortunately, and this is something which is why you'll notice that when I go through this website, there aren't many female names out there, is because these women, they're very proud of what I was doing, but they didn't want to give an interview. They said, let me know how it goes, but I'm sorry, I just don't have the time, or it's just not me, I can't sit down and give you an interview. Or when I offered to, if they could do do pen and paper, just type some answers to some of the questions I have, they didn't want to do it. they're really reluctant. And so, but they did give me other names of women who were still living in the area. So a lot of these women, they have moved on. They settled in East London, but they moved on to other places. One of the women I spoke to, she was living somewhere up north as an engineer for a chemical company. So these women, again, they're doing quite well, but they just did not want to give their name, or, you know, they felt uncomfortable publishing their poems because I guess now looking back, you know, sometimes people publish something when they're young, and then when they go back 20 years later, they don't feel comfortable. They're like, did I really write this? So I guess it was kind of that. But for me, those poems were quite interesting because those poems are actually about their experience in London, where they were newcomers. They felt, you know, they were a foreigner and what they were experiencing. So that's how I started my research. And then after Bancroft, I went on to Mott. And I'll show you kind of the articles that the way the print looks like. Mott is, if you don't know, it's one of the, I think there are only two printed newspapers that started in the 60s that still exist to this day. And Mott is one of them. So the first print was in 1969. And so if you look at the pictures, you will see that it is to do with, you can get an idea, it's actually about what's going on in Bangladesh at the time. So this is 1969, when the campaign for independence was kind of taking its prominence. Now, I took loads of photos of this of the newspaper because I just found the pictures and the adverts really fascinating. So there are no poetry there, but it's just the Bengali film, and I recognize the actor, so I took that photo. But this is what it looked like. And if you go in the middle of so it was about this thick. And so right at the center were the poetry. So you can't, my camera was terrible, so that's why you can't really see it very well. This is before Chaudhuri invested in the DSLR, so I was using my phone camera to take the photos. And so as you can see, so this is a poem, and this is sort of like a short story. And every issue I looked at, from 1969 to 1980, every issue had poetry, every issue had stories. So, and then there are some, you know, you had your cartoon kind of, what are they called? The comic strips they have in the newspaper. So Mott also had that, and I thought that was quite interesting because this is about, I don't know if you can see it, it's about waiting at the bus stop. So the woman, she's just knitting, and then she's still waiting, and then she finished knitting the cardigan. So, you know, it's like they had all sorts of things in this newspaper. So I just took loads of pictures, but there are lots and lots of poetry there. From Mott, I did try to find poets. And again, Kader Mahmood, who was one of the editors for Mott, when I got in touch with him, like, he had lots of old numbers, but unfortunately most of them didn't work. But I think I did manage to find two people, and within the first month of my, I think in 2015, so I started in 2015, I think by December, one of the poets that I did find, he passed away. So I think that also shows the kind of importance of this type of research work, is that we are trying to save the stories of people that are, you know, they're moving on. And if once they go, we won't have their story. So I tried really, I was working quite intensely to find people from that particular age group. And so overall, I collected 35 stories, and 25 of those was from the Bengali community. Now, this particular project particularly focused on the period between 1960 to 1980. Now, anyone who does research will understand that you have to be very specific because of the funding and also the time frame. And I was working part-time, but it was one of those jobs, even though I was getting paid on a part-time basis, I was working full-time. there's no way I was able to get another job because it took so much time and energy. And when you're working with older people, your time has to kind of be flexible and it has to adapt to their time frame because they are quite busy. You know, they're going to hospitals, they're going back home, or they're always they're very difficult to get hold of. So it was quite an intense project. So we focused on this particular period because it was a time that was very important in the lives of Bangladeshis, especially in London, because this is where you see a large-scale migration. So in the 60s to 80s, there was a large-scale migration to East London. The context of East London is also very important because it was politically and socially going through a lot of changes. There was terrible housing conditions. There was a rise in the fascist movement. There was a high rate of unemployment because of the sort of collapse of the textile industry. So from the 60s, you have all these events taking place, and then the new faces coming in from other communities. So it's a really interesting time. But at the same time, back home, there was a growth in the sort of the intense feeling of having an independent Bangladesh. So Bengalis were out there, you know, canvassing, campaigning for an independent Bangladesh. So it was a very interesting period. So we stuck to this particular period to see how that context, whether that context had an influence on the poetry that was being written. So I collected probably about 200 poems. Now, these weren't just from the people I interviewed. It was also from Mott newspaper, the Bengali Mahila Shamiti, and some poems were passed down by people that I met. So Chris Sell is someone I interviewed who was the founder of Basement Writers. He also played a role in helping me to find other poets who shared Bengali poems. So Chris Sell, just to give you a quick introduction, Basement Writers still exists to this day. It's a poetry club that was set up in 1970s by a teacher from the school just escaped my mind. Let me just John Cass, that's it. And Chris Sell. And what was amazing about Chris Sell is that he was a great believer of children expressing themselves through poetry. So one of the things he did was, as an English teacher, he encouraged his students to go out there during their English lesson and find something that they could use to write a poem about. And so a lot of these young people started writing all these amazing poems, and which he felt that he should turn into a book. And then he wanted to publish this book through the school, but the school didn't agree to it because they found the poems were quite dark and really negative. But he printed it anyway because he really believed in the writing skills of his students, and the poems were amazing.
There's a count by this gentleman as well in the book.
Oh, sorry?
Yeah. Sorry? He was my school teacher.
Oh, was it? Sorry, John Cass. So you were in 19...
I can't remember this. I think Harry Gosling?
Harry Gosling is the later on.
Yeah.
There's one piece by him in that book.
The Stepney
Will
Words.
found it, he sent me the link. So
Oh, okay. Stepney Words, 1 or 2? Because there's 3. 3 is the recent one. Stepney 1.
No, not this one, old one. All in a classroom or something.
Oh, okay, because he published... Okay. So I focused on the Stepney Words because that's the one he kind of recommended.
That's the original one.
Yeah, that's the original. And I actually interviewed some of the writers from Stepney Words who are now a lot older and wiser and amazing. Kim Miggy is one of them, who's like a good friend of mine now. When I met Chris Sell, he also told me that he met a lot of Bengali poets back in the days when he was being an activist. And actually, I didn't finish telling the story of Chris Sell. So when he published Stepney Words, the school sacked him because he obviously did something that went against policy. But what happened was, following his sacking, 800 students from his school went to they marched to Trafalgar Square to demand a reinstatement of their teacher, and they were successful. So he was reinstated. So anyway, so this man is an amazing guy, and he set up Basement Writers for local people in East London, which didn't just include young people, it was people from all age groups. So one of the women I interviewed, she's of Jewish heritage, her name is Sally Flood, and she was in her 30s, I believe, when she joined. So she's also kind of started her kind of journey as a poet through Basement Writers. Well, anyway, so these are the people, some of the people I met that kind of helped me to find out about other people who are involved in poetry writing, primarily Bengali people. So once I collected all the poems, I wanted to sort of think about how to present them, because I wanted the poems to tell a story. I didn't want to just collect these poems and leave it as that, and collect their stories and kind of just archive it. I wanted to, for the exhibition, I wanted to see if it's possible to create a pattern and show that there was a connection between their experience and what they're writing. But also, through the interviews, I wanted to find out why were they writing poetry, what inspired them, and what they hoped would achieve, or was there any kind of like a purpose to it, or is something that they're doing leisurely. So, and also I had volunteers. So I had, this project had 15 volunteers altogether. 7 of them were involved in doing the interviews. I did most of the Bengali ones because of the language. The volunteers, they interviewed the English-speaking participants. It was, again, the number of volunteers started to decline purely because of the timing. We had lots of issues where we would agree a time for the interviews, and then last minute the participant would cancel, and they had genuine reasons to cancel. But then the volunteers, they had university, or they had work, or they had children, you know, it just didn't work out. So the number of volunteers also began to decline, but overall I did most of the interviews. So what did we find from these interviews? What I did, now I'm just in between moving homes, so the particular drive that I have, which had the posters that we use for the exhibitions, it's in that drive, and I don't have access to it right now. So I can't show you all the posters, but what I could do is show you the notes that I made while during the organizing, when I was actually creating the exhibition. So I'm going to start with this one. What I did is I created a sort of like a storyline of the experiences and the poetry that corresponded to those experiences, and then another kind of story about the sort of like how the poetry scene emerged in East London. So I did create a time frame. Actually, I'll start with the time frame and then I'll go to these. So for this one, I actually do have the poster. Yeah. So if anyone had visited the exhibition, they would have come across this particular poster. Let me just show you. So it starts off in 1969. So it starts off in 1969 because the earliest poem I found in my research was from 1969, and it's not this one. But the reason why I put it on the poster was because I wanted to show how much the cultural platform meant to the Bengalis that were living in East London at the time.
So to make that any bigger,
Yeah, I can. So, oh, there you go. Okay, right. So, one of the, like, during my interviews, one of the question I did ask, or all the volunteers asked, was, what were they doing in their free time? So they came here, the men, they came here, they went straight to work, but what were they doing when they were not working? So bear in mind, these are all people who are either, most of them, they don't necessarily see themselves as poets, but they've written a lot of poetry. And as you can imagine, most of them actually said that they were writing poetry when they weren't working, when they weren't cooking, because these men, they all had to cook themselves. They didn't have their mum or their wives cooking for them. They were writing poetry. There's this one really interesting gentleman. God, I always forget their names. So this would be Abdul Mukhtar. So Abdul Mukhtar, and he talks about, so he came to Britain in 1975, I believe. So this particular gentleman, he said something really, like, I still remember, was he used to write poetry during his break time. So he used to work in a factory, and it was really repetitive. It was just putting things, nuts and bolts into things, and it's just doing it repeatedly. And and he used to have 2 breaks and 1 lunch break. And he goes, as soon as I would start my break, I'll just get my paper and pen and I'll just start writing things down. I'll start writing my poems. And then when I used to go home, I used to put it all together into a nice poem. And the kind of poems he wrote were, so it's not loading the poetry, should load the poem, but I'll show it to you in a bit anyway. So the kind of poems he wrote was My Chitti, which means a letter to my mother, or loneliness, or being a probashi. So probashi is being a foreigner in this country. So these are the kind of poems he was writing. But then he also went in to start writing about racism, because he began to start experiencing racism. But anyway, so, and the other thing he used to do was, once he finished writing, he used to send it off to all the Bengali newspapers he knew about in London to get them published. So this is how it worked. So in 1969, as soon as the paper opened, there was already lots and lots of poems waiting for them to get them published. So Qadir Mahmood, who was one of the editors, when I interviewed him, he told me that people didn't just post their poems to him. They used to come to the office and give them to him. And they used to demand that their poetry gets published. But he couldn't publish all of them. He could only publish a handful. And he also had to meet certain quality criteria, obviously. So, but this is a poem which I found really interesting, because this poem, so this is actually written in Bangla, but then it was translated by Qadir Mahmood into English for most of us to understand. But if you read it, it will give you, I think, a really good idea of the kind of feelings a lot of these men were feeling living alone in this country, and also this sort of, sorry, let me just get out of the way. And also the appreciation they had for something so basic as a newspaper that would, that was publishing poetry. So I'll just read it to you. To John Mott, so John Mott is the newspaper. I seek everyone's attention, seek mercy from all. Keep on for John Mott. So bear in mind, Qadir Mahmood is trying to keep the poem as close as possible to the original poetry. So sometimes, it may not make sense, but you will get the idea. Keep on for John Mott, care of your hearts. It was beyond imagination that in the heart of England, I would hear about a newspaper in Bangla language. Imaginary heaven's language I only hear about. Sweet messages in mother tongue, sweeter than honey. This is language that made me know my father and my mother. This language made me know Bongo. The ever sorrowful. In the languages expressed, suffering of the heart, may Janamot be victorious is our desire. So if anyone doesn't know what Bongo is the reference to Bengalis. This was quite common in the 60s and 70s. So there are loads of poems I came across where the main reference to Bengalis was bongo. So I think, you know, this should give you a really good idea of the kind of emotions people attach to having something, you know, which was expressing their culture, their language. But Janamot wasn't the only place where people were publishing their poetry. And in many cases, they weren't publishing poetry at all. So most of the people that I interviewed, they didn't have any poetry published until much, much later. And this was something they done independently. What they did initially was they would get together. So this is called Adda in Bangla, and I remember when I came across this word on Facebook, lots of Bengalis of different age groups, including Ahmedullah Bhai, were trying to define, you don't remember, but we're trying to define what Adda really means. Since I was managing the project, I decided I'm going to take charge and I'm going to define Adda as just socializing. It's a place where people socialize. Sorry?
It's a gathering.
It is a gathering, but some people put a lot more deeper thoughts to it, and I was like, no, it's a gathering. So they used to call it Adda Khana. Yeah, chilling out. So they called it Adda Khana. So these Adda Khanas, so Khana is like a place. So Adda Khana, place of doing Adda, place of socializing. All these little Adda Khanas started to pop up, and these varied. So for some people, it was their living room where all these other people would come along and they'll get together and they would sing, they would recite poetry that they've written or recite poetry by someone that is well known in Bangladesh or in East Bengal at the time, I guess, East Pakistan. So what I did is based on the interviews, I started to kind of create, I tried my best to sort of give a time frame. Now, bear in mind, this is actually not, it probably reflects 10% of what was going on at the time. Like I said, the time frame of the project meant I had limited time to interview and analyze the data that I had. So this doesn't reflect 100% of what was going on, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. So in 1969, and also the thing about these Adda Khanas is they weren't just a place where people were just chilling. They were also a place where people were engaging and discussing the challenges they were facing, and also the actions of their challenges. So 1969 is when Janamot was established. And then in 1975, one of the participants, Azad Bach Chaudhuri, who some people here might know, and he comes from a sort of youth work background, and he came to this country at the age of 17. And him and his friends, so he used to live where where the hospital is, the London hospital, near the London hospital. Toynbee used to have these sort of like, they used to rent out these rooms for single.
I know Azad Bach and I know Toynbee and the residences because I came here in the 60s.
Yeah.
I came here in 1966, so a lot of these people that I know as well. So I just keep quiet and listen to what
No. You should join in. You should join in because I'm just literally like giving a snippet. So I think the quality of the story would come better from someone like you. But they used to live in these halls of residence because they're single men. And so what he talks about is a couple of these young people, bear in mind they're teenagers, 17-year-olds, when they're not working, and they worked long hours, and when they weren't working, they used to go to college to learn English, or if they're interested, or taken up other courses. But what him and his friend did is they set up the Rainbow Sporting Club, and what this club usually involved was them organizing a trip to cinema, or it was sort of like sitting together and sharing the poems that they've written. So there was this like little kind of groups that were setting up everywhere. Okay, so this is something you're involved in, the formation of Bangladesh Youth Movement.
Yeah, I was the founding chairman.
You were the founding chair.
General secretary.
So I found, Bangladesh Youth Movement is actually a massive, I would say is probably, and I come from, like, one of the first job I had was for Muslim Youth Helpline, which is a counseling support service. And what's interesting about these projects that were set up in 2000 and, you know, in that period, the models were taken from the early projects such as the BYM and like also Osmani's offshoot, all of that. So this is like, in the 70s, you had this really amazing grassroots project that was setting up that were dealing with social issues. And these issues were not just dealt with by having you know, heated discussions. They were also expressed through poetry. So I'm going to show you some poems later which involved mobilizing people to tackle the challenges that they were facing. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the things that I came across. So BYM drama group. So another person I interviewed, Ashraf Mahmoud Naswar, he's heavily involved with Bengali drama projects now. But again, when he came to this country as a teenager, one of the first place he went to was those spaces where he could express himself creatively. So that's your other organized Pagor Kollan Shomiti.
Pagor Kollan Shomiti. Ashraf, Ansar and I used to write the magazine and put it out at Montefiore.
So I and broadsheet of the mad. Could you remind me why you
explain the title, please?
It just means Madman's Society, and it was basically giving us a way of expressing the views of the young who were known by our parents as being the mad generation. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And Ansar and I used to write a broadsheet of just poetry, a number of different things, and we just put it out, today's news, just in a satirical manner, and we put it out at Montefiore in the canteen. It would be gone. 500 copies would be gone within. People used to turn up just to see what we were writing, and it would just go out very quickly. So that's and when you talk about BYM's foundation, when you talk about Adakanas and you're talking about BYM's foundation, it started off in a street just opposite this Cavell Street in a friend of ours' front room. Because we didn't have anywhere to gather, so we would pay him 10 pence for the electricity, each of us, and we turned up just to use his front room to gather. So that's where BYM originated from, and that's from there we moved on to Burner Centre and a number of different places, but that's where it originated from, us gathering there. And one of the first events was the Drama Society, which we put on a range of different plays through Myrtle Street, the centre there. That's where we were, and Shan Lutframan was a friend of ours who was involved, Omar Bos and others who were people who were involved in the theatrical arena. And some of us are still involved in the theatrical arena, doing a range of different things. I still sit on Wilkins, which is one of the oldest surviving musical on its board, looking at different plays that we put on. So that's where a lot of that generation came up, and these sort of issues, and a lot of it was getting rid of our frustration in relation to not being able to partake solidly in the society that we were being brought up in, and not belonging to our parents' generation either, and being able to deal with that. So this was our way of relief.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean,
sort of perspective, yeah.
That was a story that I came across from a lot of different poets. So again, just to mention Abdul, who introduced the term Ad-Dakhana to me. He used to also have little gatherings, well, Ad-Dakhana, in his house. And what he did, I mean, he kind of invited the younger generation to join in, because he started to notice that they were responding to racism in a way that was more, well, he thought they would get into trouble because they were living alone in this country. So poetry for him was a way to get them to stay away from getting involved in something violent, and also at the same time to express themselves in a more creative way that also was a release for them. And his Adakana was also interested, like some of the English poets who are involved in kind of interested in Bengali poetry, from, for example, his name just escaped me, translator of Rabindranath Tagore, William Radici, yes, that's it. Yeah, I mean, he was also, he used to visit Abdul Makit's house a lot. So he used to live by Shadwell, I believe. So, you know, all these little kind of pockets of projects started to set up. And then there was this really interesting one again, was Abdul Salik's Dishari band. So Shilpi Gushti. So again, it was really fascinating. And what I found is that, especially in the 70s, so Mukhtar Bai on one hand was trying to like find a more creative way to kind of, well, get people away from getting into fights with the fascists. And then you have Shukr Bahir, who was kind of like using poetry as a way to mobilize people. There was also Abdul Salik Bai, who was also involved in kind of mobilizing people to be more active. So one of the things that Dishari did, well, as part of his role in Dishari, was to write this song called the Trade Union Song, because he was a member of the Labour Party and he was the only Labour member at that time. And so he kind of wanted to encourage more Bengali men to join the Labour Party who were working in the factories. And I think this is after there was an incident where some men died. There was a fire in a factory and some Bengali men died in that fire. So he became quite, you know, incensed, and he knew like the only way for these men to protect themselves was to be part of the trade union. And then he started to perform this song called the Trade Union Song in various different spaces the Bengali men used to hang out. So one of them was the Nas Cinema in Brooklyn, which no longer exists. So every Saturday they used to show these films, and every Saturday before the film they used to perform their song. So then you have all these different kind of projects that was popping up. And then you have the Kobi Nozrul Center that was established in the 1980, Joy Bangla Youth Organization. Then you have the Kishore Bibhag. There's so many that I came across through just interviewing people. And then the last one was I put down is Shanghai Literary Society because it makes sense. I work for the organization, and they were established in 1989, but actually they formally established in 1989, but it's in 1984 that when they were 16, 17 years old that they actually came up with the idea. So this is just a very small time frame of some of the major things that happened, but not everything. This doesn't reflect every amazing project that was set up at that time. I just wanted to want you to bear that in mind. Now, what I did, the other thing that I did from looking at the poetry is I divided the poems into different categories. Like I said, we wanted to see what kind of role poetry played in the lives of Bengalis, and also where did it come from. So in my interviews, I also explored that side of the participants. And there's one I wanted to play, but it's in Bangla, but I'm going to play it anyway, and I'm going to try my best to translate it. So this is a poet who is he came, well, he was born in 1951, Rahmat Ali Patni. He moved to Britain in 1978, and he started off working in a factory, but then he actually purchased 2 factories in London, in the Brick Lane area, and then, but his leisurely time was always spent on writing poetry. So I did ask him what were the reasons why poetry was so important in Bengali life. So I'm going to play in Bangla. I mean, it's in Bangla, but I will talk about it in English in a bit, and I hope the sound is okay. Just let me know if you can hear it. No sound. I'm going to stop here because I think I just played the wrong one. See if I can find the right one. Maybe it's that one. Okay, I've got so many recordings. I'm not going to try looking for it now, but I'm going to show this note that I made while I was doing the preparing for the exhibition. This is very similar to the poster we showed, but just to give you a history of the role of poetry in the Bengali culture. So from the interviews, so a lot of the men who I kind of, and female poets who I kind of wanted to get an understand, they grew up in Bangladesh and they came here after getting married, or they came here when they're 18, but these are people who were born in the 20s or 30s. So a generation that I felt was quite well established in Bangladesh in terms of their poetry skills before they came here. So Rahmat Ali Patni, who I wanted to play where he actually does sing to demonstrate how he was trained as a poet. And again, he's someone who doesn't regard himself as a poet, but he said that when he went to his secondary school, which was an Islamic madrasa, an Islamic school, the way one of the kind of most important part of their education was to recite poetry which told the history of their religion. So the story of our prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, or stories of other poets, prophets, and they learned those through kind of songs, and it's called Nat, so Hamnat. So that was something they were trained in from a very young age when they went into secondary education. The other element was his older sister. Now, again, he wasn't the only one. There are other gentlemen that I interviewed. They also said that they had their older siblings who encouraged them, who used to give them books written in Urdu or written in in Bangla, or even in some cases in English, and to encourage them to sort of learn the verses. And this is something they use to kind of, when they're like, as we say, we have a banter. The way they used to have banter was by reciting a poem. So based on these sort of interviews, I kind of came up with a few roles that the poetry played, which kind of something that led poetry to kind of establish itself as a kind of a very important part of their life. Now, there's something that I didn't mention in the exhibition, but a lot of them, but it's very important, especially in the Muslim context. The majority of Bengalis in Bangladesh are Muslim, and in Muslim cultures, historically, one of the way to assert one's prestige and one's social status was their ability to recite poetry, and also their ability to write poetry, because language and the way one expressed themselves was I suppose, the main marker of how sophisticated they were and sophisticated the education was. So I think that also played a massive role in families encouraging their children to spend more time in developing that skill to write poetry. So generally in the 40s, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, I guess, poetry was the main form of entertainment in the Muslim gathering. So a lot of Muslims' weddings, they didn't have music, or they did, but they had drums. So Rahmat Ali Patni, he said to me that the life in the village was very different when I was growing up, and the entertainment was very limited. There was no cinema hall or anything like that in the village, because the older generation used to think that was a bad influence in the society. Also, the religious leaders were against it. But there was one kind of entertainment that people liked when there was a wedding or other gatherings, and that was reciting poems. I used to write poems for the weddings, and this was another kind of poems in which a story used to be narrated. And again, Dabirul Islam, who is also, who came to England in 1957, but he was already, I think he was 30 plus when he came. And he's a very, very broad-shouldered, tall man. And when he wrote poetry, like when he recited poetry, I'm going to play some later, it's like the whole room kind of shook. He's got such a powerful voice. And just to give you a background about Darul Islam, he didn't actually settle in East London. He settled in St. Albans, but then later on in the 80s, that's when he moved to East London. But he was writing poetry from a very, very young age. And again, it was in his school, secondary education, where he started to get training to write poetry. And so he says that I come from a very religious family, and everyone encouraged me to express myself through poetry, especially my mother. She used to be the best orator of dhada. So this is, dhada is riddles. Has anyone ever heard of dhada? So I mean, I tried to look for examples when I was developing the exhibition, but the problem is I couldn't even understand what was being said. So it's like, I'm gonna leave that. So he actually does give me lots of, so I've got a recording of him giving me dhada. So I don't know if I already mentioned, all the interviews are archived at Tower Hamlets Local History Archives. And so you'll have access to all the, hopefully by now it should be ready, because last time I checked it was being catalogued. That sometimes takes time. So I actually collected his dhada. I didn't translate them because I could not find anyone who could understand them. And unfortunately with Mr. Darul Islam, he's quite, when I tried to get him to translate, he struggled to translate it into English. He kept saying, well, what would be the point? It will lose his, because he's a very passionate man. He doesn't believe in translating these things because it would totally lose its character. So I couldn't get them translated, but they do exist in the archives. So he says that a lot of encouragement. So I used to be invited at time to recite Thada at weddings. At weddings, the two parties, groom and bride, used to compete with each other on Thada. The guests used to love trying to figure out what I was saying and work out a way to respond. So again, it's like the most, I suppose, what I can think of right now, that would be a good example is if you go to the hip hop scene, and then you have two MCs.
If you look at what a lot of these were, because a lot of these formations of poetry started off in the villages, what we used to call recitals of putti. I don't know if anybody's ever heard people really reading a story, and it's like an early version of rap, basically. Really reading it in that sort of way. So that's where a lot of this started off, and a lot of people wrote their own stories, which then they recited. And at weddings, what used to be is you would come out with a line, and the female side would try to beat you down. It's just like slam down in a rap.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
That's how I was picturing it when.
The early formation of those in the villages that used to happen, and it goes on even now in a traditional. It still happens in the villages.
Wow.
So that's
Just
it hasn't
for
disappeared.
information, it's common throughout Bengal and in the community as well. We had Priyanka Boshu speaking just on the subject, and she gave short examples of all these musical competitions.
Yes. And if you look at Abdul Karim, a lot of his stuff is what? Poetry. A lot of the songs are poetry and from a simple village.
But I just want to say what you're referring to is Jarigan. Jarigan is very much, so just to go over what Jarigan is, it's actually rooted in Islamic, so Shia Muslim history. Shia Bengali Muslim, Shias Muslim, Shia Bengali history. So Jarigan is where you would be, it's like Putti.
No, if you listen to Abdul Karim's song, Grammar Nojuan, what does it talk about? Grammar Nojuan, Hindu Musliman, Amra Age ki shundar din kataitam hare, Age ki shundar din kataitam, Grammar Nojuan, Hindu Musliman, Milya Baula Kanar Munshide Gaitam, Milya Baula Kanar Sharikan Gaitam, Age ki shundar din kataitam. That's basically a poetry recited about Bengalis, Hindus, Muslims getting together.
Yeah, Lalan Fakir also did a lot of that.
And really not worrying about the politics of the country, really, but really looking at it from a different perspective of what simple life in the villages used to be.
Yeah.
And now they're all been spoiled by the politicking of society and things like that. But these are pure poetry.
Yeah, so I mean, the
Very beautiful voice.
he used to sing. I found his videos when I was doing my research. I was like, wow. I really wanted to I thought maybe I should put it in my exhibition, but I thought, I don't think I can get the copyright. So the other interesting role that, social commentary, I mean, it's a way to, talk about past was, in the response to communal violence that existed in the 19th century, you had Shah Abdul Karim and Lalan Fakir, they were trying to remind people what it was like. But what I found really interesting of the 20th century village life was that poetry was also a source of news. So a lot of people, they couldn't read. And also in many places, they can't afford to publish newspapers. So they talk about a murder that took place in another village, like 9 miles from where they were. The men used to stand in front of a market spot, so a place where everyone would go. There would be the mosque. There's the market. Well, after prayer, they would go to the mosque or a temple. Everyone goes to the market to do their shopping. And they'll stand at the entrance and they'll start reciting poetry, which was actually giving a news. This happened in this village. You're not going to believe what happened. They had, so this is how they actually, shared news. So now we have Facebook, but they had their poetry, which I thought was really amazing. Let me see if I can actually, because I did record him. and it is all in my main drive, which I actually don't have access to at the moment because the main drive is with Shanghati. And so for data protection and everything, you know, I didn't like bring everything. So unfortunately, I don't have it with me, but he did give me a beautiful example of that. Sources of spiritual growth and reflection. So this is obviously something that is quite, I mean, we're all aware of. So again, Rahmat Ali Patni says, in those days in madrasa, children used to sing Islamic songs, ghazals, naat, which still exist today, and inspired, oh, so this is what he inspired him to write poetry as well. And they used to have ghazal competition. So all the kids, they, you know, again, like a method that the schools use to encourage kids to write poetry. Now, what's interesting, I actually spent a few years in Bangladesh when I was, well, my formative years. And we didn't have that. I mean, I went to a really kind of like a good school. But what we did have was writing essays about our, you know, religious background, which I thought was so boring. I mean, I did not enjoy writing essays anyway as a kid. But imagine like you had to write poetry and you had to express your heritage through poetry, which I thought would be so much more interesting. But yeah. And then, obviously, finally, politics. I mean, so poetry was a source of, the role played by poetry was political activism. So Abdul Bashar Ansari, he's probably one of the oldest participants. And he says, like, my poems were about the local issues. If there were issues with our rivers, water, or there was a need to improve something, I used to write poems about it and submit it to the local newspaper. In the early 40s, I wrote a poem which I helped to get enough signatories to pass a bill to build a new bridge in Russellgrange. So if anyone knows Russellgrange, there was a bridge that was built as a result of a campaign that took place through writing poetry. So it was, you know, I mean, its role is, I mean, the way they kind of used poetry was just amazing. Now, I also tried to go a little bit further than further back to early sort of 19th century to kind of see if there is anything that I could use to connect the inspiration and the encouragement a lot of these early generation that gave them the inspiration to continue to write poetry. And I actually did my master's, my dissertation was on Lalon Fakir. So I kind of had a good idea. And also I kind of grew up with that. Like whenever I tried to talk to my dad or mom about Lalon Fakir, obviously everyone can be a bit sort of regionalistic. So my parents grew up with the Sylheti, you know, or poets. Yeah. So my parents grew up more with Abdul Karim and Hassan Raza. So and I noticed that there was a reference in their everyday understanding of lots of things. They would often quote Hassan Raza, and so I kind of what I did was I spoke to some of the participants about their feelings and whether that also had some role in their passion for poetry. And so, you know, they kind of like said that when they were in Bari, in their village, and they had some time to think, or when they were little, when they went at school or in madrasa, they used to be in the farm, helping their father or helping anyone who was employed by their father to do the farming. And they used to sit there and they used to sing songs by Hassan Raza. And a lot of them felt like they carried that. So Hassan Raza is a folk poet, and a lot of his songs are about the soul and about being trapped in this violent world. And a lot of the people, they kind of said that they felt the same when they were like living here. So that's why I thought, you know, there is this connection. So you know, like for a poster, I kind of gave a background that these people, not only did they receive this kind of education where they were encouraged to write poetry, they grew up in this environment which was just filled with poetry. So this form from the soul of Sylhet to the heart of Stepney, you know, they live behind their, Moina bird is a bird that is used as a reference to talk about it's like the, you know, you are the bird and you are the caged bird. You know, it's again, it goes back to sort of Sufi kind of thinking. And in Bengali poetry, what I found, a lot of the poems, they refer themselves, or they use Moina bird as a reference when they're writing about being a foreigner in this country. So it is that kind of being caged, they've left behind their soul. So that, and that reference about Moina bird, which I found really interesting, was extremely common in poetry by Hassan Raza.
The poem was called Shunar Pinjira.
Yeah.
So it was the gilded cage. It translated into English. That's what it was.
I could not understand the Bengali version, so I just stuck to the English. So before I show you some poems from which I categorized as, you know, their experiences as foreigners in this country, I think, like, if I read you this, you'll probably have a good, you know, understanding of what they're referring to. So this says, "O soul, O Moina bird, will you fly away? Yes, O Moina bird, belong to the air, into the air you will fly away. But I, O Moina bird, am the earth, to the earth I'll fall and stay behind. And O Moina bird, when you leave me, O Moina bird, to which realm will you go? And O Moina bird, will you find any trace of me? Is there no love, no pity in the heart, O Moina bird, that I am desolate when you leave my breast? Knowing you will leave him, dwelling on the thought, Hassan Raja wonders, hopeless, weeping, bitter tears." So this will take me to Prabashi. Which one's the Prabashi? Is the poster 9. I'm really sorry for the visual. The poster did look very, very amazing. Actually, I think I do have the poster for this. So, and no, I don't. No. Oh, I don't. That's a shame. Right. Now, for the posters, I only selected 2 poems because obviously I didn't want to put everything on the exhibition. In the exhibition, we did have an actual copy of the book, which unfortunately we finished. And like I said earlier, I'm in between moving, so the other house has the books that I couldn't get access to. But anyone who would like the book, I can email it to you on a printed version, on an electronic version. And you will find a lot of the poetry that I've placed under the category of Prabashi, which is being a foreigner. There is that constant reference to Moina bird. Now, a lot of the poems I've already mentioned talks about their kind of feeling lonely and missing their family members. So there are lots of letters that I've come across. Poetry that I came across was about writing a letter to the mother, writing a letter to a father, but mostly mothers. A lot of the men, they're writing poems, which was called Mar Chiti or something along that line. And I did use one. I have one here by Abdul Mukhtar, which I'll read to you. So I mentioned Abdul Mukhtar was someone who moved here. He was working here in the he moved here in 1979, and he started writing his poetry when he was working in the factory, and during his break time he would write his poems. And this is actually one of the first ones he wrote, and this was published in Mott. This morning, the past has already gone, and still no letter from you, mother, still no letter from you. I'm here alone and far from home. Your letters bring with them such peace, but their absence a turmoil of anguish. This world I enjoy was your gift to me, and for that I can never forget you. And there's none to share the pain that I feel when your letter does not arrive. Like the fishing boat marooned on the mindless shore, when the waters recede in the heat, on the burning sands, the shadow of your care, in comfort and solace to me, in sorrow, in joy, wherever I am, in your letters I find my solace. So again, this is a translation. And this was translated by Andrew Durham, who was also someone heavily involved in Abdul Mukhtar's Abdakhana. Yes? Sorry? Oh, Andrew Wareham. Sorry, yeah. I made that mistake. But anyways, this is my early notes, so there will be lots of mistakes there, sorry. Yeah, like recently, I've never met the translator, so I went with what they told me. And then this is an interesting poem. Now, this is actually one of the few women that I interviewed. So Shahida Azad, and she still lives in Tower Hamlets, and she moved here when she was probably younger than she was 18, because of the passport. Like not a lot of people have their actual birth certificate. But she moved here in 1972, and so on paper she was 18 years old, and she was writing poetry before. Her dad was someone who encouraged her to write poetry, and also she told me a story because her father was someone quite, he was involved in politics, so he used to get invited to a lot of kind of official events in their town, just outside of Sylhet, and she said that she was such a keen writer, such a keen poetry writer, that even when she was 4 or 5, she would sneak into her dad's offices or like their official events and functions, and she'd stand on the stage and start reading her poem. So she was writing poetry from a very young age. So this is a poem that she wrote when I guess she was more settled in London. And I actually have her poems which she wrote when she first arrived. So her experience at the airport, and the thoughts she was having while she was communicating with this woman, and she couldn't speak English, and so all these little things that was kind of making her worry. She goes into detail, and I have those poetry, and I have them translated. They're all available in the book. But the reason why I chose this one to publish on the for the exhibition was because she wrote this poem while she was sitting by River Thames. So, and when she was sitting there, she kind of remembered Shurma. Shurma is the river of Sylhet. Sylhet is known for Shurma River. And it was a way she kind of started to miss what she left behind. And so I think this poem also kind of gives you a good idea of the nostalgia of the sort of the early generation. So she writes, time and again we come to meet on some seashore. Many appear to respond to our call to come to this distant Prabash, a foreign land. Seated on the bank of rippling Thames and viewing it from any side, it appears we're sitting on the riverside of Shurma. On the Shurma boats floated away in full monsoon, singing Sari songs. So Sari, Sharigan. Is that Jarigan?
Jarigan is slightly different. It's the way the lyrics are written.
Okay.
Shari and Jariat, slightly different.
Okay.
It's the way the lyrics are written.
All right.
Far more flowy.
Shari is more flowy than Jari. Okay, because Jarigan is essentially telling stories, isn't it?
Shari is flowing.
Flowing. Okay. So there's no Sari singing on the Thames. So small dinghies float on its waters rhythmically with the waves. That's why it feels like today we're sitting as the Shurma bank. So, I think I can't say that like the experience of women in terms of being a foreigner, like what they were expressing. Differentiated, like there was also reference to river, to birds and nature by a lot of the male authors, male poets. But there is one thing that I didn't come across in the very few women that I did interview was the talk about racism. So, but it was quite common amongst the male poets. So this one, no. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to go into the resistance. Yeah. Oh, right, sorry. I'm kind of... Okay, I'm going to stop after this other poster. So one of the most common theme amongst the male poets was writing about racism. And they were quite powerful. And some of them are actually already, they have been published, but I thought I have to publish them again because they are published in earlier literature that I found through my research, but I couldn't see them as being archived anywhere. So I thought, this would be a very, important poems that I didn't want to miss, and I wanted to make sure that they were already archived. So Ashraf Mahmoud Neswar, who I mentioned earlier as someone who joined, when he first came, he joined the drama club. He also became quite active socially in terms of movements, politically. And so one poem that I'm just going to quickly I'm going to quickly read is the one he wrote immediately after the death of, I believe it was Kenneth Singh. He was the youngest of all four to have been murdered. Sorry?
He lived in Plaster, he got kidnapped.
He was an 8-year-old, 10-year-old. And so this is when, and what's really interesting, I didn't know this, but the first, the biggest march to take place against racism by people of color actually took place in Brick Lane. And this was the same period. So you had many people like Neswar Bhai who were writing these poems and publishing them and getting them out there on radio to mobilize as many people as possible to go out there on streets in Brick Lane to protest against the Nazis. So this one he wrote, and the purpose of such poem was to mobilize people. And so he writes, Altab Ishaq, Kenneth Blair, the victims of racist brutality, concealed behind the mask of aggression, how much more tears to be shed by the human soul. Let racism be extinguished forever. Let funeral pyre burn at racist abode. Let us march together courageously to challenge the murderous oppressors. The fight is for human values and with heart-filled conviction of golden sunshine. If any bad storm is hit, the oppression will be beaten with our soul. Flames of protest burn in the chest. Pains of losing own people turns into storm. The crimson days will be as distant as the northern star playing symphony in the universe. Finally, I just want to go through this other category, which I thought was really important. And that was, let me see if I've got the poster for that. Yeah. So poetry as social commentary of Biliti, meaning Biliti is a term used by Bengalis for fellow Londoners or people that live in England. And so a lot of the poetry that I found were comical. They're just making fun of other Bengalis, people who are, up to no good and, doing things that they wouldn't normally do back home. So there was all these really funny poems. And so I thought I'll read this one particular one. And this was actually by the current secretary of Shanghai Literary Society. And he actually did publish this book, and I love the characters he has in the book, so I just wanted to recreate that. So I'll just read it. Uncle Gedu's shop. Uncle Gedu opened a dukan. Dukan is a shop, like a grocery store, newsagent, and called it a shop. There is everything from greens and shutki. So shutki is the dried fish that us Bengalis love, as well as meat chop. So I think in translation, I'm not sure the best way to translate. But it's not just meat chop, but it's like along the side of meat and all that kind of stuff. But we couldn't really think of any other way to translate it to go along with the rhythm. Fish and meat are all halal. Halal lamb ghost. Eating all this is now making everyone shusto. Shusto is being very healthy. So this is the time when, I think, like for Tahir Bhai, who wrote the poem, he said this is when Bengalis were starting to eat more and more meat, because before they couldn't really access it much, they had to travel far and wide, and then all of a sudden you have all these meat shops. So this is something he noticed. You too take care. Fresh deshi bacha. Bacha, I have no idea what it means. Bacha is number 5. Bangladeshi basaf. Okay, so fish. Mama had it earlier, as had Chacha. Mama means maternal uncle. Chacha is paternal uncle. Very tasty to eat with tomato and leaves of kodu. So kodu is like a marrow, but there's a specific type you get from Bangladesh. It tastes good with fish. Frog's umbrella from Desh becomes a mushroom in Bidesh. So mushroom, literally, the literal translation of mushroom in Bengali is Bengal chata. So he just...
Frog's umbrella.
Frog's umbrella, yeah. And then everyone says it's not like billet. Living here feels like home. Coming here from abroad, living like we're back home. So this, actually one thing I didn't mention is a lot of the poetry, when you read it, and if you're from East London, you will know exactly which area the poem is about. So this one, you would know it's actually about Whitechapel or the surrounding area, because you have a Bengali who's saying he doesn't feel like he's in in Bidesh, he's in Bangladesh. And even now, I have brought some of my friends who are from other parts of the world to Whitechapel because I love this area. And I don't live here, so for me, it's like I bang on about it. When I bring them here, and I actually get offended by this, when they say, oh my God, I don't feel like I'm in London. And I say, no, you are in London. This is London. But it's just a place where everyone feels like they're at home. So I think I will finish here. But I will say this, if you do want the publication, I can email it to you. We have run out of the printed version, but please just give me your email now and I'll email it to you directly. Thank you.
We have some questions and any question or any comment or anything?
Oh, and the other thing, sorry, you can actually go to the funding. We didn't actually have funding for a website which will a long time, where you can access some of the interviews and some of the stories that I collected. So what I did is I actually I turned a blog into a website, so hoping that it will last forever. I might have to pay for the URL in 10 years' time, which is fine. I mean, the HLF actually funded that, that's fine. But I recreated this hoping that even if someone doesn't go to the archives, at least this will make the stories a little bit more accessible. I'm still actually working on this. It all depends on when I have time. But you will find a lot of the interview snippets here. And one thing, so for example, one of the very few women that I interviewed, Shahida Azad. So this is the poem she writes about coming to this country. You will have access to it. But it has the interviews, snippets of all the people that I've interviewed, and tiny, tiny snippets, nothing big. But at least it will give you some kind of idea of what I've collected. So Abdul Salik, I love this photo, so I posted it. The trade union song is there, and he actually, you can even watch the clip of the trade union song. So there are lots of, oops. Yeah, there are, I think, oh, sorry, let me just, but there are some resources that I hope that will make you feel useful.
If you look at those pictures by Dan Jones,
Yeah.
you see almost all of those people, all of us are painted in his pictures. When you look at them, if you look at them, you'll find that you'll see us appearing in those pictures.
Actually, I have used Dan Jones's artwork on the posters, but no, I didn't know they was.
If you look at close, I can tell you name almost every character.
I actually have them. Maybe you can show me later.
Including Dan and his family, and all of us are in those pictures.
Any question? I think there's one question.
Hi.
Thanks very much. That's really very, very close. Very nice to hear about the history that I'm not very part of. So I was thinking about what about the rest of the Bangladeshis in other parts of London or the UK? Maybe think of that basically, that's all. But what I want to ask is, what's the role of poetry now, would you say, in the Bangladeshi community currently? Do they still have this passionate relationship poetry? Is it transferred to the second and third generations, or do you know much about that?
Definitely. I mean, the people that I've interviewed, I mean, there are a couple of cases where I was interviewing the father and they were insisting that I also interview their children, but obviously it wasn't possible. But yeah, they are passing it down to the next generation. In some cases, I didn't see it. And like, it wasn't on the interview, but we had this conversation, like with some of the participants, I've had this conversation, and what they said was, you know, their children, because of their life, the work-life balance, they couldn't really pass down the Bangla language. You know, they couldn't educate them about the Bangla language, and the only kind of way they can express themselves is in Bangla. But the other thing is, their children have so much more opportunities and so many platforms that they can access to express themselves.
Rap and stuff like that.
Oh no, I'm talking about specifically the participants that I spoke to as to why they haven't passed down that skill set to their children. So yeah, like some, they have encouraged their kids and they are writing poetry, but obviously they write poetry in English. And there are others who kind of lament the fact that they couldn't pass it down. But also, interestingly, the ones that have passed it down, they come from like a slightly younger batch. They're age-wise, they're now in their 60s. Whereas the one participant who really hoped that he was able to do that, to pass down those skills to his children, he's in his 80s. So I think that may have something to do with it as well. So it varies.
I was just thinking, because the Bengali identity and relationship to artistic expression is quite intimate. So whether it's in the form of Bangla, I'm just wondering, you know, I'd imagine the Bengali community, the third generation onwards now, has that changed that? There must be nuances of it, you know, having living in Britain now, you know. So I was wondering, and if this may be something you might have to answer, because it's obviously about future as in now rather than.
If I got your answer, your question correct. The younger generation, I think there's less relevance to poetry, and they, as Faridha pointed out, there's more platform out there now to express themselves.
It depends on what you call it and how you look at it. There's a massive scene in East London right now, which is Bengali young guys rapping. But the social rap is poetry. And if you realistically look at what that is, it's about their present situation. I will send you a DVD of some of these guys, because I go and listen to these guys. They still have their atakanas down Commercial Road and a number of others where they just go and jam. Where they just go and jam in an evening. And it's good to listen to some of those.
When I was growing up in the sort of 90s, it was all about rap.
Yeah.
Because people used to write the lyrics on the pages.
Exactly.
So they didn't do their homework.
Kids
When they
are
started
still
doing
doing-
concentrating, they were just
doing
writing.
that.
One thing I didn't mention, but what I actually found it quite interesting, is a lot of the participants, their adakana was kind of like very specific to whichever part of Sylhet they were from. So this lady, Shahida Azad, she was saying, oh, you know, us Shunamganjis, we used to all get together and we used to recite poetry. And then someone else like, us Biani Bazaris used to get together. So I thought that was really fascinating. And I think coming back to what you've asked is that kind of, I suppose, exclusive like feeling towards sticking to your own kind to express yourself, that has totally disappeared probably. So now it may not be as visible, like in terms of the cultural expression or engagement that Bengali kids are sort of participating in, because they are out there in every space. So it's not like a specific Bengali space, because we didn't grow up like that, you know. So it could be just Northwest London. They're hanging out, they're doing stuff in youth clubs in Northwest London with kids from all backgrounds. Recently, Chris Sell actually published Stepney Words 3, where a lot of the writers, you know, little kids, they wrote amazing poems. Some of them were Bengali. And then there are, but then it's a book where you have kids writing about their experience, and they've come from different, you know, loads of different backgrounds. And there was last year, I'm sorry, I don't remember the actual project, but there was a Bengali girl who won an award for writing a poem about her experience coming from Sylhet and growing up in England. So I think she's still in secondary school, but she moved here when she was 13 or 12. So it was her teacher who kind of published her poem. I'm going to find out, because I think it's during the beginning of my research, I got in touch with that lady. I don't know why, but I was really inspired. But I think the context has changed. There's a lot more platforms for kids, and they don't have the same probashi. No kid's going to feel like they're a probashi, I think. Sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say thank you, Faridha. It was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it.
Oh.
Whilst you were talking, I was actually accessing the website of the blog and looking at it. And first thing was, couldn't Bank Road take it over and, you know, not take it over, but give people access to this or pay for it or something to be...
Never really discussed it, really. I think they could easily. It's something I did on the side, which is why you don't see any photographs, because when I took permission, like the only photographs you see are the ones that I actually got permission for myself to publish. And I just, it's because I met Ahmadullah Bai through this another oral history project I did in Camden. And literally when I finished, it also disappeared. I don't know what happened to it. So this time I was slightly more careful. It is in the archives, it is being catalogued, and also I just wanted to keep it alive, because archives can only do so much. Like I used to work at London Met Archives, and you could do what you're kind of like, you're supposed to, you have to get permission. Your workload is based on the bigger plan of the archive. So even if I pass this on, there is no funding for them to manage this site, but at least when I'm kind of managing it, I'm talking about it, I'm raising awareness of it, but I have not told the archives about this.
A good way
So
of
I
doing
think I
this
will.
and maybe keeping it going even longer is to allow people to publish, get their works published on the website through a range, and that can be done in such a way of dealing with it. You can crowdfund it. People will crowdfund something like it.
I think one thing that
to keep it going and allow that experience, so it turns into basically a platform for getting things published.
No, I agree.
That want to write about those sort of issues. That would be one way of looking at it.
I had another point, which was just about, despite Theresa May's best efforts, people are still coming from Bangladesh. And they still have been. So it's not that we're talking about people like, you know, of Shakur Bai's generation, and it stopped. You know, you talked about this young woman who was in Bangladesh until she was 13, and people are continually coming, or they're coming via Italy or whatever. So, you know, I think it's really alive, and I just wondered how much, it's a lot to do, and the period you were looking at was obviously different, but whatever the poetry scenes are in Bangladesh at the moment, how they can be
I don't think I can answer that question because I haven't really looked into that. But coming from, the background, I would say the access of education has changed. So my parents' generation, there was so much encouragement to write poetry that no longer exists. The education sort of framework in Bangladesh definitely has taken a massive shift, and it is more to do with your science and your engineering and your mathematics, and very little concentration on cultural side. So just to give you an example, I spent 4 months, literally after I finished this project, I went to Bangladesh for 4 months, and I lived in Dhaka for 4 months, and I was looking around. And I did go to Sylhet for a bit, because between the age of 3 and 11 I was living in Sylhet. And when I was living in Sylhet, there was a place called the Shisha Academy, which interestingly got popped up by some of the people I interviewed. The Shisha Academy is a place where you go and express yourself. You learn to write poetry, you learn to do art, dancing, whatever. And then when I was asking people when I went back, I was like, oh, what's Shisha Academy is up to? Like, who sends their kids? Nobody sends their kids to those spaces. I mean, people that I met, they're still running, but it's like you don't have to go to a separate space to learn about poetry, learn about dancing and singing anymore. It's happening so close to your house. And I think as a result, there is no kind of like a community spirit in this kind of stuff. It's quite, it's like, what's the word? No, there's a word where it's like everywhere, but it's not together. Dispersed, yeah, that's it. But it's
gone into the mainstream far more than it used to be.
But at the same time, people aren't connecting with each other on this thing. So it's something that happens at university, but I don't know, I think...
Just another thing, this is I haven't done any research, it just sometimes, some ideas come to your head, some explanations that come to your head. What I think happened is that, in Bangladesh, or Bangladeshis, it's slightly different from West Bengal in India. In Bangladesh, the biggest role model are two poets, Tagore and Nuzul. There's no other, who kind of ranks, their level. One got Nobel Prize, and the other one not recognized outside, but within the country is considered kind of like Tagore, but slightly different. Yeah. But so, when you're growing up, they were the only two people who were the biggest role model. There's no scientists, no business people, nothing, right? Yeah? So that was one thing. And also, the Bengalis in Calcutta, West Bengal, after around 1840s, they kind of gave up, trying to do business, trying to do enterprise. They all went into all the, this drama and journalism and philosophy and things like that, because they had their hands burnt, trying to do business in the 1840s, right? Yeah? So there was too much development in the culture, in arts, in theatre, in poetry, and literature, and so on. And then the Bangladesh, the Muslim, they sort of inherited that, later on. And then you had this struggle in Pakistan time. So there was a lot of use of poetry and those symbolism to try and promote, this culture. But what has happened since that Bangladesh has kind of started to develop in different fields, right? And more and more young people, they've got diversified interests.
Yeah.
Before, everybody wanted to be a poet, right? But then poetry is still there, right? It still plays a very important role in children growing up. But then it's not like the 90% or 60%
it's lost.
They had on their life.
It doesn't have the same Bengali kind of character to it. Like, I was staying above an art school in Dhaka, and they were learning about art generally, and then they would have the special days where they would dress up and celebrate some Bengali event like Spring Festival, whatever. But if you look at the artwork, it's heavily influenced by Western culture, or the way they express themselves is heavily influenced by Western culture. I mean, the kids today are more, like, the way they express themselves, I would say, is very, very Americanized. Whereas in British Bengali kids are British Bengali, but the kids in Bangladesh, they're very Americanized. But I'm talking about the middle class here. But then the girls that come here, like a lot of the women that are married and come here, they actually do come from middle class families. And again, it's the education they receive is, well, my experience with my relatives is they were becoming accountants here because that's what they studied in Bangladesh. And so they're not receiving the same type of education. Maybe there are, but I can't answer that question, yeah.
Faridha, thank you very much. That was wonderful. And actually it meant a lot to me because for years I've been waiting for someone to archive and to have translated precisely those poems from John Mott and immediate working class background. It's tremendous. So if you could cover that doesn't matter. Can I ask a tiny detail, which is sort of not the main point I wanted to say, thank you, that's the main point, but you mentioned William Radice, and I just wondered whether it was actually meaning Angela Wareham, because I wasn't aware that William Radice, for all his deep involvement in Bengali poetry, came up to the East End, whereas Angela was based here and working in housing issues and going to many British Bangladeshi families almost every evening and also going to many cultural events. So I'm just wondering whether
He mentioned both.
he did.
Yeah, so if you listen to his interview, I'm not sure if it's the one of them. You can go to his like name, and I'm not sure if I've actually listed that there. But if you listen to the whole interview, and the transcript is also available in the catalogue. So he actually doesn't just mention those two, but he does make a reference to other people who have actually gone on to. I'm so sorry, I'm really bad with names, but this other poet who's also very renowned for translating.
William Radice was desperate to
There's William Radice, and there's another SAWAS person involved, like had some connection to SAWAS. He also went. So there are kind of Joe something. Joe Winter, that's it. So yeah, there are a couple of people who were quite involved, and this is when they were also learning about Bangla language. So this is a quite early period.
William Radice